Pawn b2 to b3.
Knight g8 to f6.
Pawn c2 to c3.
Pawn d7 to d5.
Pawn c3 to c4.
Pawn d5 takes c4.
Pawn b3 takes c4.
Queen d8 takes d2.
King e1 takes d2.
Pawn e7 to e5.
King d2 to e1.
Knight d8 to c6.
Pawn a2 to a4.
Bishop f8 to b4.
Bishop c1 to d2.
Bishop b4 takes d2.
Queen e1 takes d2.
Castle k-side.
Knight b1 to c3.
Bishop c8 to f5.
Pawn g2 to g4.
Bishop f5 takes g4.
Pawn h2 to h3.
Bishop g4 takes e2.
Queen e2 takes e2.
Knight c6 to d4.
Queen e2 to d1.
Knight f6 to e4.
Pawn h3 to h4.
Knight e4 takes c3.
Queen e1 to d2.
Knight c3 takes a4.
Rook a1 takes a4.
Pawn a7 to a5.
Pawn c4 to c5.
Pawn b7 to b5.
Rook a4 takes d4.
Pawn e5 takes d4.
Queen e2 takes d4.
Pawn a5 to a4.
Queen e4 to d1.
Pawn b5 to b4.
Queen e1 to d4.
Pawn a4 to a3.
Queen e4 takes b4.
Pawn a3 to a2.
Queen b4 to b1.
Pawn a2 takes b1, promoting to queen.
King e1 to e2.
Queen b1 takes f1.
King e2 takes f1.
Rook a8 to a2.
Knight g1 to f3.
Rook a2 takes f2.
King f1 takes f2.
Pawn f7 to f5.
Knight f3 to g5.
Pawn f5 to f4.
Pawn h4 to h5.
Pawn f4 to f3.
Knight g5 takes f3.
Rook f8 takes f3.
King f2 takes f3.
Pawn g7 to g5.
Rook h1 to g1.
King g8 to f7.
King f3 to e3.
King f7 to e6.
Rook g1 to d1.
Pawn g5 to g4.
King e3 to d3.
Pawn g4 to g3.
Rook d1 to g1.
Pawn g3 to g2.
Rook g1 takes g2.
King e6 to d5.
Rook g2 to g5.
King d5 to c6.
Rook g5 to g4.
King c6 takes c5.
Rook g4 to g5.
King c5 to c6.
Rook g5 to e5.
Pawn h7 to h6.
Rook e5 to e6.
King c6 to d5.
Rook e6 takes h6.
King d5 to e5.
King d3 to e3.
Pawn c7 to c5.
Rook h6 to g6.
Pawn c5 to c4.
Pawn h5 to h6.
Pawn c4 to c3.
Rook g6 to c6.
Pawn c3 to c2.
Rook c6 takes c2.
King e5 to f6.
Pawn h6 to h7.
King f6 to g7.
Pawn h7 to h8 promoting to queen.
kg7 takes h8,
Rook c2 to h2.
kh8 to g7,
King e3 to e4.
kg7 to f6,
Rook h2 to h5.
kf6 to e6,
King e4 to d4.
ke6 to d6,
King d4 to c4.
kd6 to c6,
King c4 to b4.
kc6 to d6,
King b4 to c4.
kd6 to c6,
Rook h5 to h6.
kc6 to b7,
King c4 to c5.
kd7 to c7,
Rook h6 to h7.
kc7 to d8,
King c5 to d6.
kd8 to e8,
Rook h7 to h8.
ke8 to f7,
Rook h8 to h7.
kf7 to f6,
King d6 to d5.
kf6 to f5,
Rook h7 to f7.
kf5 to g4,
King d5 to e5.
kg4 to g3,
King e5 to e4.
kg3 to g2,
King e4 to e3.
kg2 to g3,
Rook f7 to f6.
kg3 to g2,
King e3 to e2.
kg2 to g3,
Rook f6 to f5.
kg3 to g2,
Rook f5 to f4.
kg2 to g3,
King e2 to e3.
kg3 to g2,
Rook f4 to g4.
kg2 to f1,
King e3 to d3.
kf1 to f2,
Rook g4 to h4.
kf2 to f3,
Rook h4 to h3.
kf3 to f4,
Rook h3 to f3.
kf4 takes f3,
King d3 to d4.
kf3 to f4,
King d4 to d5.
kf4 to e3,
King d5 to e5.
ke3 to d3,
King e5 to d5.
kd3 to c3,
King d5 to c5.
kc3 to d3,
Rook h4 to h1.
kf3 to f4,
Rook h1 to f1.
kf4 to e5,
King d3 to c3.
ke5 to e4,
Rook f1 to e1.
ke4 to d5,
King c3 to b4.
kd5 to d4,
Rook e1 to d1.
kd4 to e4,
King b4 to c4.
ke4 to e5,
Rook d1 to e1.
ke5 to f4,
Rook e1 to f1.
kf4 to e4,
Rook f1 to f3.
ke4 takes f3,
Rook f1 to d1.
ke4 to e5,
Rook d1 to d4.
ke5 to f5,
Rook d4 to d5.
kf5 to e4,
King c4 to c5.
ke4 to e3,
Rook d5 to d4.
ke3 to f3,
King c5 to d5.
kf3 to e3,
Rook d4 to e4.
ke3 to d3,
Rook e4 to d4.
kd3 to c3,
Rook d4 to c4.
kc3 to d3,
Rook c4 to c3.
kd3 takes c3,
Rook h6 to h8.
pawn c5 to c4,
Rook h8 to g8.
pawn c4 to c3,
Rook h8 to c8.
pawn c4 to c3,
Rook c8 takes c3.
Ke5 to F5.
Pawn h5 to h6.
Kf5 to F6.
Rook c3 to c5.
Kf6 to G6.
Rook c3 to c6.
Kf6 to F7.
Rook c6 to c7.
Kf7 to F6.
Pawn h6 to h7.
Kf6 to E5.
Rook c7 to c4.
Ke5 to D5.
Pawn h7 to h8 promoting to queen.
Ke5 to D5.
Queen h8 to f6. The game is a draw.